Well, good day. My name is Don Tipping, and we're here at 7 Seeds Farm in Williams, Oregon. And we're also the home of Siskiyou Seeds, which is a family farm-based organic seed company where we grow about half of the seed that we distribute nationwide through a website and also seed racks that are more regional. We also work with about 18 other small family farms scattered around the Pacific Northwest that have similar farming approaches to what we do here: organic, open pollinated, small scale. So we buy seed on contract basis from them and distribute it through our seed company here. And over time, for years, we used to grow a lot of wholesale seed for other large national mail order seed companies like Johnny Seeds, Fedco, Seeds of Change, and so forth. And that was working out for us, but as my kids began to get a little bit older, I saw having a vertically integrated business, the seed company, would diversify the tasks that are involved in running the business. So instead of just farming and horticultural knowledge, there's also, web design, graphic arts, photography, video, record keeping, bookkeeping, all that. So I see a future for this of really being a family business where there's jobs for age 5 to 95 within it, as something that can be a long-term legacy project, if you will, because and that kind of leads me into why seed. Where are we? What's going on in 2018 with seed? And I think it's an important thing to look back a little bit and think about, in my view of thinking about this a lot, seed, if we could see it metaphorically, as like one of the legs of the table that civilization rests upon, the foundation, and those other ones are air, water, and soil and seed. If you take away any one of those, the whole table falls over and civilization collapses. And we can see that around the world. I just read South Africa only has 90-day water supply left for Cape Town, the central city. And we're just, unless we focus on those things that are truly important, then they go away. And we're seeing that with seed right now because we haven't focused on it for, I'd say, about 50 years or maybe even up to 100 years as a society. We're seeing the big multinational giants of agribusiness, Monsanto, Bayer, Dow, DuPont, is moving into that void. So if you think about seed going way back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, when we began to gather seeds, and you can think about who these people were, they were just moving around the landscape with some deep degree of intuitive, as we say, traditional ecological knowledge is the term I've heard, and I like to use that. It may look primitive to us, but it's actually a very sophisticated reading of the landscape. So if you noticed a certain grass or some annual plant that made a lot of seed, you'd go harvest some of that for food. And as soon as we began storing that seed as grain, as food, like in this area, the indigenous people harvested acorns and tarweed seeds, and also balsam root was like a sunflower relative, and they'd get an oil from the seed. So that's actually a very primitive form of seed saving, of agriculture, if you will. It may not look like tidy rows and so forth, but at that moment we made a huge transition, because as soon as you're storing seeds, saving seeds, you have a village, you have a permanent encampment, and then all these things grow out of that. Civilization, art, seasonal rhythm, festivals, ceremonies, this type of thing, and that was really the starting point of civilization. And it's interesting because it's in accordance to biologist Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphogenesis, morphogenic fields. Agriculture didn't necessarily just start in the Fertile Crescent and then spread organically. It co-emerged in different spots around the planet simultaneously. So it's something that we should be teaching in school. And one of my favorite lessons about this is a Russian botanist by the name of Nikolai Vavilov, who had experienced that famine had come in waves in Russia and Eastern Europe, that part of the world. And as a botanist, he wanted to do something about it. So how he went about doing this was going around the world in 1905 with like donkey trains and so forth, and a lot of people to carry all the plant material they gathered. And he amassed the largest seed bank on the planet at that time in Russia, and identified that there were 8 regions on the planet where our agricultural crops originated. And if you look, nowadays we have the data to look at this from the World Wildlife Fund. If you overlay those 8 regions that are the Mediterranean, India, China, Ethiopia, the Fertile Crescent, Middle East, Oaxaca, Mexico, the Andes Mountains of South America, if you overlay that over a map of total species of biodiversity, plants, animals, fungi, lichens, all of it, they match up exactly. So basically our indigenous ancestors that had more colors in their palette, so to speak, could develop more edible foodstuffs. So that's to me amazing, because if we understand that and we honor indigenous agriculture and our indigenous seed saving lineage, then we also preserve biodiversity on the planet. And this, I think, is the huge elephant in the room nobody's talking about and focusing on, that really would give us a nadir point for the compass of what our focus for humanity should be in this time. Because it's not just about saving the rainforest or the ecosystem. You've got to save the indigenous people that know how to steward it. You have to sustain the cultures that enable them to be successful stewards. We don't really know what we're doing as modern industrial people. We're kind of just trashing it wherever we go. So again, going back to that seed saving thing, that is a defining moment of civilization. We can't really do much about creating air, water, and soil. I mean, we can grow organic matter through good regenerative farming practices, but we can do something about thoughtful, intentional, resilient seed saving. And if we look at our history over time, the successful civilizations were the ones that could create a stable agricultural productive system. And civilization failed when the climate made it no longer possible for agriculture to subsist, or they began to overreach their supply lines of being able to produce enough food to keep the empire in check. And that's, just the blueprint of civilization. So again, it's ironic that we've let seed go, so to speak, kind of let it go to the dogs. And, fast forward a bunch of time, one of my mentors, Dr. Gary Paul Nabham, who's written a great many books, wrote a book called Where Our Food Comes From, in which he looks at that Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov's work and actually goes on a pilgrimage himself around the world looking at all those places now, or in recent times, what's happened in the last 100 years, and seeing the decline of a lot of these regions. But he made the assertion that I think is a really poignant one in agriculture, and I think something to really humble anybody involved in agriculture on any scale, even if you're the stock boy at the produce market, is that 99% of the work to create the food that we grow was done 300 years ago. We advanced it from wild plants to virtually, as we see a zucchini, a pepper, a tomato, whatever it is, wheat, coffee. That 300 years ago, we'd already done that work. So what we've done in the last 300 years with all our science, all our biotechnology, all of our plant breeding, all of the human creativity and intellectual brilliance amounts to less than 1% compared to what we had 300 years ago. So if you walked into some market in India or China 300 years ago, or the Middle East or the Mediterranean, you would witness an incredible spread of diversity of flavors and aromas, and you would find nothing lacking. And so this is an interesting point to underscore all the advances that the biotech industry is trumpeting about why we need to go with biotech to feed the world's population. So I'm going to set that over there right now and just kind of fill in the gap between 300 years ago and now in terms of a historical overview. The first seed company was in the mid-1800s. It was Burpee. William Atlee Burpee created the first mail-order seed company. So where did farmers and gardeners get their seeds before that? They just grew them and saved them and exchanged them. It was like a family heirloom. And we use that term now in association with vegetables, but I think it's important to break that word down and understand what does the word heirloom mean. So, going back to medieval Europe and the origin of the word heirloom, so we tend to, when you hear the word heirloom, you think like, grandma's china, or, jewelry, or heirloom tomato. This is the context in which we use this term, but where the word came from was the weaving guilds of medieval Europe. And I'm sure they had a similar word in other parts of the world to describe this, because clothing was one of our essential things as, modern humans. So, a weaving guild may include many families and individuals of many ages and genders. And it would include raising sheep, shearing the sheep to get the wool, carding the wool, spinning it into yarn, weaving it into cloth, and then eventually making clothing out of it. So the heir of the loom would mean that, let's say your parents were master weavers. At some point, they would teach you all the weaving traditions and then pass the loom on to you. So the heirloom didn't just mean, the loom, the physical object. It meant the whole system. All of the flock, the weaving patterns, the designs, who actually buys your cloth, what do they do with it, the different thicknesses and weaves of the cloth. Down in Peru, they weave their cosmology, the Indian people, of which there's many different tribal affiliations of indigenous people there. They weave their cosmology, their history of creation into the cloth. And in order for a woman in many of the Andean tribes to be of marriable age, it's not an age, she needs to have already learned something like 50 weaving patterns of this intricate pattern, and then all the natural dyes and the plants that are associated with that. And some of those are wild and some are cultivated and some are not even plants, like cochineal is a bug that grows on prickly pear cactus, and they gather that to make red and purple dye. So, that's amazing when we think about that term heirloom, and I think it gives it more gravitas rather than just something you randomly find on the ground and stick in your pocket and sell at some, antique store for value, but it really represents your culture. And so we've become so divorced from that as agrarian people, where we go back to, we'll fast forward a little bit from that first seed company back in the 1850s, of which probably not many people patronized the original Burpee seed catalog, because people had their seeds. They didn't want to try somebody else's seeds. They're like, hey, these work for us. It just fed our family and kept us good. Or if I need another one, I got a neighbor down the road. I've noticed his farm looks good. I'm going to ask him or her. So move this along a bit to the 1930s. At the time of the Great Depression, 70% of people in the United States were involved in agriculture. Lived on farms, worked in some close way with agriculture. So when the Great Depression hit, everybody had somewhere to go. They either grew up on a farm, or they had an aunt or uncle who had a farm. They knew how to hunt, fish, garden, and do things like make sauerkraut. That was just part of what people knew at that time, and that's not the case anymore. Most people don't have those type of skills. So you can see that's just an important, I think, demarcation of, in 80 years, let's say, of how much has changed, how quickly we've gone from 70% of people in agriculture to now it's about 1/4% of people actually file farmer on their income taxes. Just this minuscule amount. I've heard other estimates that say 2% of people involved in agriculture, but a lot of those people are probably working in packing facilities and processing, or they drive a truck that delivers produce. It's more involved in the business and the distribution and processing. Or to put it kind of more colloquially, there's a funny meme that says organic food, our grandparents just called it food. So, we look at the seed movement as farming became more of a business through the 1900s. We had the birth of seed companies as a business model, as there was more of a need for productivity because there was more people needed for the war effort, industrialization. And if we look at World War I, was a really important turning point because it was the first mass mobilization of the industrial might of the United States, if not the world. So tanks became tractors. Poison nerve gas became insecticides and pesticides. Bomb making, chemistry, basically, mining nitrogen to make bombs became the chemical fertilizer industry. And one of the questions I like to ask when I'm teaching about kind of the history of farming and agriculture is, what's the most important invention in the history of humankind? And people want to throw out answers like fire, the wheel, penicillin. They're intelligent answers. but they're all completely eclipsed by the Haber-Bosch process for converting atmospheric nitrogen into anhydrous ammonia fertilizer. So at this point on the Earth, and I'm deviating from seed a little bit, but the chemical industry and seed, you'll see, are very, what seem like unlikely bedfellows, but now they're very close bedfellows. So, as we saw that process of the war machine became applied to agriculture, as we wanted to boost productivity, we needed to basically get the animals off the farm, because farms back before tractors, 70% of the land would be for cows, horses, pigs, sheep, what you needed to actually do the tillage of your fields and provide the fertility. So if a farm was 100 acres, they had 70 acres in pasture and 30 acres in crops, of which some of those crops were grain and hay to feed the animals. So your productivity or profit per acre could never be very high, but you did have sustainable whole systems models that were, self-regenerating organisms. So back to the Haber-Bosch process, and this is really pretty fascinating to me. We've doubled the amount of nitrogen that we apply to farmland globally. So the other places that nitrogen comes from are nitrogen-fixing plants is the first one, so peas and beans, but in the tropics and the more equatorial latitudes, like on the savannas of Africa, those trees that you see behind the elephants are oftentimes acacias, and that's a nitrogen-fixing tree. So that's the one source. Manure, you can imagine all the animals on the world and all the manure they make, that's a very rich source of fertility. And then the third is a bit of a curveball, unless perhaps you grew up in the Southwest with the mythology of the indigenous people of that area, is lightning. And I know the Navajo, the Dene, and the Hopi have all this cool cosmology about the thunder gods bringing life and fertility. Because lightning is such a powerful source of electricity that it breaks the bonds of the molecules in our atmosphere. So in the rain of a thunderstorm, there is nitrogen. It's a fertility. So it's not only bringing life-giving water, but bringing fertility to it. So that's a lot of nitrogen. Those three sources added up total over the entire planet. Since the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, which uses natural gas to, like lightning, break the bonds in the air, because a lot of our air, our atmosphere, is nitrogen, but it just doesn't come out of the air readily as a usable source. And nitrogen is what makes plants green and really grow, and is very mobile in the soil. Rain will leach it out. It gets used up by plants. So it needs to be replenished if a system is going to have high fertility and be productive. So we've doubled that amount. And we've all seen that image of the oil wells with the flame on top, like from Texas in the 1800s. Well, they were burning off the natural gas because it was really dangerous. So they would just constantly burn it off so it never built up in quantity. So natural gas was seen as a cheap, available source of energy. And they're like, well, let's make fertilizer with it. And we've done that ever since. But now that we're running into this wanting to kind of go green and get off of the more dirty fossil fuels, we're using natural gas to power buses, power plants, all these other things, and it's driven the price of fertilizer through the roof, which is, it's a bit, again, an elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about, but a lot of farms in the Midwest that are running a fairly thin profit margin, their fertilizer bill is now getting so high that that's challenging that economic model. So we'll leave that there. That's a really important turning point that happened, I believe, in the 40s when we began to do that. So and then we get into the 50s is when we had the first hybrid seeds. And plants hybridize all the time in nature. We're all hybrids of our parents. It's a completely natural phenomenon. We shouldn't demonize that word at all. Sometimes people in the organic gardening camp will not want to have hybrids. But really what they're challenged by is the business model of hybrid seeds. So to explain it really quickly, whenever you get two dissimilar individuals that mate, you get what's called heterosis. And there's all the ancestral potential of each that crosses and moves forward. And there's, oftentimes what's known as hybrid vigor. The scientific word would be heterosis. And so this was really evident in corn, and you can imagine in the U.S., the corn belt, and as we used to have a much greater diversity of crops, but we realized we're in the humid tropic summers of the Midwest, the Southeast, all the places where it rains in the summer. corn is a tropical grass originating in Mexico. It thrives with abundant water and sunshine. So how can we get corn to be more productive? So they really refine that whole hybridization process around field corn. And most of the corn grown in the U.S. is what's called Dent corn. And I think it's important to back up that corn started, the ancient ancestor near Oaxaca, Mexico. That's the people that lived down there were the one that brought corn as a grass called teosinte. The Latin name is Zea mexicana, easy way to remember where it's from. And the kernels, they look like a chicken beak. They're just tiny little hard things. You'd break your teeth trying to eat them. They're just a little, like smaller than your pinky. It doesn't even have a cob. It doesn't look like anything you'd want to eat. It does look like a corn plant. So anyhow, they somehow took that plant and turned it into flint corn of actual, ears like what we look at, and they, use that to make cornmeal for all sorts of food stuff. So the first flint corns too. Nowadays we use flint corn for grits, hominy. Popcorn is a type of flint. It's the most primitive ancestor of domesticated corn. And as that moved north, it got bred into flour corn as people were always striving for a finer flour to get, just more usable grain product out of it. And then that moved into North America with the Apache people. They're credited as the, first North American native tribe to bring corn. And now it's gone all the way up into Canada of these little short varieties, 3-4 feet tall, that can produce grain in a short season. And at some point, somebody bred a popcorn off of that and a sweet corn, but that was much more modern. And then at some point in the 1800s, somebody crossed a sweet corn with a flint corn and created what's known as Dent corn. And that's the main, when we hear of GMO corn that they use for animal feed, ethanol, all the big industrial processes, that's all a Dent corn. So you're not going to get a GMO sweet corn at your farmer's market. It just doesn't exist. They don't do that because most of the corn acreage right now is grown for this Dent corn. It's the highest yielding. They talk about how many bushels per acre, and with modern hybrid technologies, they're just going for yield. And again, we have to see how this is a system, this industrial agriculture, that brought us away from seed saving, because they could demonstrate a higher yield with modern hybrid Dent corns, but it went hand in hand with herbicides to control weeds and also the fertilizers that they were applying to be able to get those yields. When you look in a cornfield on an organic farm or garden, you're spacing the ears about 1 foot to 18 inches apart. It's a big plant. It needs room to grow because it has a big root system. It needs to access the fertility to grow that big plant. In an industrial monocrop cornfield, the plants might be a couple inches apart because they can apply so much fertility that the plant basically just has an IV of nitrogen right there. So we go back to that Haber-Bosch process. And what's interesting, again, to back up to that point, and this is, corn is one of the big ones globally that's driven the human population explosion. Before the Haber-Bosch process, and this is why that was such an important invention in the arc of human history, the human population had been growing at a fairly small to steady rate. We were at 1.2 billion people at that point, and that, interestingly enough, coincided with fossil fuels being discovered and used on a larger scale. Now the human population is just going on a vertical level, and as some sociologists and anthropologists have called this modern time the Anthropocene, where we came out of the Holocene, which is the post-glacial epoch that's been going on for about 12,000 years, and now we're in the Anthropocene. So if we look at the human population right now is 7 billion and change, 6 billion of that is because of the Haber-Bosch process. These people would not exist if it were not for the chemical synthesis of nitrogen and industrial agriculture. So in a way, it's pretty amazing, because a lot of those people wouldn't be alive if it were not for that. But it comes at a heavy toll. And we're seeing, because they keep trying to push that growth curve, that's why we're witnessing an unprecedented monopoly being created on seed by the very same chemical companies that produce the fertilizer and the pesticides and herbicides and fungicides that go with that whole industrial agricultural model. So, and this is why the United Nations has said that small-scale organic biodiverse farming is the only way we're going to be able to feed the planet, because you can never sustain a growth curve forever. It's just not, that just does not happen in nature. That always is followed by a crash, and we don't want to be around when that crash happens. So that's why, there's this great opportunity right now to retrofit, regenerative agriculture onto this system. So, we look back to seed as we began to get into hybrids and pushing for that yield, just pushing for higher yield. That's what the number one impetus for plant breeding since the 1950s has been about yield. They left flavor, nutrition, storage quality in the dust because a lot of this food we're putting in cans or freezing or some processed food. So we don't need to worry about how long is it going to hang in your root cellar. So you have food in the middle of winter. And so when we think about that impetus for yield, now we're just watching, just one subsequent insanity after another taking place. And now we're in a situation, and Dr. Vandana Shiva, who's a physicist from India, a woman, has been one of the more articulate voices around this. And I would go so far as to say she's a modern-day Gandhi for, life on the planet in terms of understanding what's happened. Where did we go wrong? So from the 1950s, when we had the first hybrid seeds available, they were like, this is great. Let's do this with all sorts of crop. So they began to hybridize cotton, wheat, canola, soybeans, you name it out there. Carrots, broccoli, lettuce. You can't really do it with lettuce. Sorry, I misspoke. But the cross-pollinated crops. So, and that requires a lot of effort in plant breeding and university dollars and R&D basically to create these new hybrids, always looking for a better yield, a lot of testing and stuff. So how are you going to pay for that? If a farmer can just save that seed, because you can take a hybrid corn seed and plant it and save seed from it, and it'll still grow. And in a lot of parts of the world, like in Mexico, it's very routine that they'll buy hybrid seed and then save seed for a couple of years, and they notice it declining in its uniformity and productivity, and they'll go back to buying new hybrid seed and get a couple years out of it because they can't afford to buy it every year. It's much more expensive. So in the, I believe it was in the 1970s, we had the Plant Variety Protection Act, which is shortened as PVP. And it was a fairly simple patent that protected the intellectual property that went into plant breeding that said, all right, you get a 20-year exclusivity on this variety you bred. Nobody else can buy the seed and save seed and sell it. They can save their own seed or use that in breeding of new crops. You can't regulate that. But we need some way to recoup our investment in the development of a new product. And it makes sense when we look at other aspects of business. If you could just get the blueprints for the latest whatever and make your own, then how would the originator be able to recover their R&D budget? So we began to apply that business model to seeds and life. And then, the PVP was followed up by, in 1978, the first patent for a life form, an actual utility patent, was granted in 1978 for a microbe, a genetically engineered microbe that would eat oil. And they used the spin and the emotional sensation around the oil spills that happened off the coast of California in the 70s to push this through. This is Supreme Court level. They were debating, like, should you be able to patent life? Like saying that you created a life. And because it was an oil-eating microbe and everybody thought that it would do good, it would clean up oil spills, they let it go through. If we were talking about a dog, a genetically engineered dog, we might have had a different decision. But anyhow, ironically, the oil-eating microbe turned out to be a bit of a disaster because it didn't stop at eating oil. It began to, disrupt and eat other things in ocean ecosystems, and they don't use that anymore. It just didn't work. So that opened the doors for doing a lot of research about GMOs through the 80s, and now we see, the top crops planted acreage-wise on the planet are all genetically engineered. And those are corn, cotton, soy, canola, sugar beets, because most of our sugar in this country, 60% of the table sugar comes from genetically engineered sugar beets, not sugar cane. And now they're going through the other less important crops, potatoes. They've tried for wheat for a lot of years. There's quite a few other ones. But they went for the ones with the most acreage because if you're trying for a monopoly, go for the ones that everybody plants. So in terms of seed, the control of seed used to be farmers would save their seed and plant it out the next year and just kept the cycle going. And then a marketing campaign happened through the 80s and 90s that really said to the farmer, your seeds aren't good enough, we've got this new one, you want this. It will get better yields, less problems from bugs because you can spray this insecticide or whatever it is. And farmers gave up their traditional seeds, and once you give them up, you can't go back. Let's say you're a wheat farmer with 1,000 acres of wheat you grow. You're not going to just go, where are you going to go? There's no seed on the shelf that's like old farmer's wheat variety. It's all the modern varieties. That's what's on the shelf because we've abandoned the old system. Just like imagine what it was like to get parts for your draft horse powered farm implements once tractors became what everything happened. You had to be a blacksmith or really resourceful. And the same thing is happening with seed. That knowledge now of how to save seeds, how to do plant breeding is all being consolidated in industry and universities. And instead of farmers owning seeds, they're buying seeds. But now with modern genetic engineering and the way the intellectual property agreements work, you don't even own the seed when you buy it. Let's say you're a big farm and you buy tens of thousands of dollars worth of seed every year. You don't actually own that seed. You are licensing the intellectual property that's in the seed for one growing season. And any leftover seed has to be destroyed or not planted. And this is a very different relationship to life. Imagine if, every breath of air you took or drink of water, you had to sign a non-compete agreement or an exclusivity contract for these basic building blocks of life. And so I think that there's a lot of problems with the science and technology of genetic engineering, but I think the one thing that is a really where we should be focusing our attention on is it's taking control of seed away from the hands of people and put it in the hands of attorneys and corporations. And now we have what are called utility patents on seeds. And many seed varieties, like a genetically engineered corn that's resistant to the herbicide Roundup and perhaps produces its own biotoxin, a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis that when caterpillars, like a corn root maggot, for instance, will eat the plant, it'll die. But also if the pollen from that corn that's producing this biotoxin lands on a milkweed plant, over here in the ditch, and a milkweed plant is the food source for the monarch butterfly caterpillar. When it eats the leaves of that milkweed and it eats some of that pollen from the GMO corn, it's going to die too. So we've kind of opened Pandora's box on a biological level, but when we look at it purely just on an ethics level of now no one owns seeds on the big scale, it's all owned by the chemical companies who have all these restrictive utility patents that isn't just saying we invested a lot of energy and resources and money into developing this new variety, but we literally created like an invention. A utility patent is for an invention, like a new iPhone. They get a utility patent on it. So if you copy their technology, you're in infringement of the patent. That's fine. That's all like in the human created world. But in life, you didn't create corn. I mean, come on, you're just like embellishing on it. Like who gets an award for embellishing upon a masterpiece painting? No, nobody wants to see that. It's already, good. Just leave it be. So this is a very different relationship, and I think we're going to be seeing the utility patents tested in coming time as they patent traits that were pre-existing in nature, like red in lettuce or heat tolerance in broccoli, or some aspect, some trait is being patented as a novel invention, like, hey, we own that now. And then some other independent plant breeder that creates a variety, so that you can be successful with climate change in some other part of the world. These biotech corporations have every legal right to go after that person or company or farm in violation of their patent. So this is a really important thing to understand about the control of seed and ownership of seed. And it's complicated because we all want to demonize the biology of genetic engineering because it's just plain and simple, not natural. And the biotech people are not stupid. They're really smart, and they know that. So like the new Arctic Beauty apple is a recently deregulated, genetically engineered apple that's on the store shelves now. But it didn't use a gene from a different species. It used a gene from a wild apple that they spliced into a domesticated apple. And in doing so, when you cut this apple open, it remains white and it doesn't brown. That's so great. Thanks. But if we go after that on an ethical basis of you should not do transgenic breeding, then that apple doesn't fall into that category of like, well, what's the big deal? If it could be a flower from a wild apple crossing with the pollen of this apple, and we just create a new variety. So this new narrowing of the terms of what is a genetically modified organism is a bit of a smoke and mirrors thing. So again, I feel like as a movement, we need to focus on the seed freedom, as Vandana Shiva calls it, and seed sovereignty. That agrarian peoples and cultures around the world have a right to grow, maintain, save, and plant their own seeds. Okay, so there's the problem. I feel like I've identified okay, there's some problems there. What are we going to do about it? And we could spend our life fighting that model, but clearly it's a very powerful industrial model. They control the governments and the chemical companies and all this. So we may not be successful in that. I feel like in terms of myself and my life, what I like to do is I like to work towards a positive future. What's working? So, with our seed company here, Siskiyou Seeds, we grow and select, which means, we'll go into a population of something that's growing and find what we like and save seed from those individuals. And not just what we like, what's thriving, what's naturally adapting to the climate, disease, pest pressure, and the other stresses that may be in the environment. And that's how we got to the agriculture we are at now, is through farmers just paying attention and saving, intentional seed saving. So, from that point, we, do this breeding work, and then we're growing seed and distributing it on a small scale. And I think we need just small scale seed collaborations, because I can't do it all myself, working with other people in a region to do what works for this region, and over there on the other side of the mountains they will have a better idea for what works for them over there. And again, taking the control of the seed out of the hands of these corporations that to put it in perspective, Monsanto bought Seminus Seeds about 10 years ago. They were the largest seed company in the world for $1.2 billion. So Monsanto was so big that they were able to buy the largest vegetable seed company in the world. Seminus was actually a conglomeration of a couple other large industrial seed companies. Well, now Monsanto is getting eaten up, bought by Bayer, which we may know of from the aspirin, but they're actually a large German chemical agribusiness consortium. So, that whole model is going that way. So, what is the other paradigm is kind of going back to how seed used to be controlled in the past, was in the hands of the people. But because we've lost the seed-saving knowledge, we can't just distribute seed and just give it back to the people and say, here, go at it. There's a knowledge and a skill set that goes along with it. So we have to rekindle and sort of, revitalize that movement if we want to have a stable, secure, well-adapted seed supply for the future. And I honestly believe that seed saving can be one of the most powerful tools we have for addressing climate change moving forward, because climate change is moving so quickly. There isn't a library to go back to get seeds that could adapt to drought or something else, because you have seeds, you can't just lock them up in a library. You have to grow them out year after year after year. So they're always working in a feedback loop with the environment. So you have to, just like if you're a musician, you can't be a cover band just constantly playing the same old songs. You have to be writing lyrics and melodies that address the times we're in to be the art form that's relevant to now. So climate change, I think the most effective tools we have are obviously stop doing the bad things that are messing it up, but proactively is the thoughtful breeding and selecting of crops for adaptation. The same thing, ideology applied to our perennial crops like fruit trees, grapes, crops that are not propagated from seed but are clonally propagated. And then animals as well, breeding species of livestock that can, like chickens that can produce eggs with less feed, can forage for more of their diet and are naturally immune to diseases and pests just through thoughtful selection. Basically Darwinian intelligence. And one of my mentors, he has pointed out that Nikolai Vavilov, the Russian botanist who amassed that huge seed bank back in 1905, who later starved to death in a gulag prison because he was identified by Stalin as an intellectual elite that was just amassing knowledge for his own aggrandizement, where they couldn't see that he was looking at the greater good of the people. And what's ironic, this might be a good kind of wrapping up this story, is the siege of St. Petersburg in Russia. That's where the Vavilov Institute was. And this is in World War I. They had the world's largest seed bank with potatoes, grains, vegetable crops, herbs, the world's largest seed bank in this building. And the staff, they boarded themselves up in this building while the German troops were attacking the town. And Hitler's plan, I'm sorry, this World War II. I'm sorry, I misspoke.
World War II, yeah.
I misspoke here. So we're, in the 40s. Hitler's plan was to deliver his victory speech from the balcony of the Vavilov Institute. And what does that tell you about the importance of seed? They failed at that. And also, they failed because the people that worked at the Vavilov Institute, whose 8x10 photographs are now on the wall in like a museum thing, starved to death rather than eat the potatoes, grains, and seeds, beans, and things are food. They could have eaten that. They all starved to death in there because they knew the value of that seed bank for global starvation. And they would rather starve to death than see millions starve to death in the future from that type of work being plundered. And the same type of thing, we are seeing a siege of the collective inheritance of our agrobiodiversity right now by the biotech corporations and the indigenous cultures that created and stewarded these crops for centuries, if not millennia. We're seeing that happen right now with the biotech companies and their just total biopiracy. And that's why you see people like Vandana Shiva, Winona LaDuke, and others leading the rallying cry of what a crime against humanity and nature this is. So again, back to just a simple thing. We need to get a lot more seeds in the hands of the people, all ages, all over the planet, just doing the simple work of seed saving and gardening. And then their whole nightmare paradigm, it's like, well, we don't need you because we've taken care of one of the essentials of life all along. And that's why an understanding of the role of just simple seed saving, it should be part of the curriculum in our schools at all ages as just something you do. So hopefully that was a helpful little historical joyride.